Mrs. Lett, thank you so much for meeting today for your post-observation conference. Um, I would just like to go over some questions with you, but briefly, would you please just start off by telling a little bit what your lesson was about yesterday?
We started off by putting up decimal fractions on a number line. That was our number work for the day. I had it up on the front of the board, and the kids came up and put the fractions up where they would go. And then I started to introduce tenths of decimals by relating it back to the decimal fractions, and we started to put those in and what they would look like using base 10 blocks, and then also coloring in models for the decimals before the students went and did a problem on their own number lines back at their desks.
Great. As you reflect on the lesson, to what extent were students meaningfully engaged?
I think during the number work portion where they were coming up to the number line, I think that they were very engaged. However, they struggled. They've never had decimals before. Besides with money, they don't really have any exposure to decimals. So there was a little bit of a struggle there when it came to connecting the fraction to the decimal. And then when they did their problem back at their seats independently, most students I think were very engaged. Again, there were a few strugglers that I really had to work with, and I wish I would have done a second launch with.
Great. What was your overall purpose of this lesson?
I really wanted to get them introduced to tenths, especially when it came to decimals, and I wanted them to be able to write the decimal to the tenths, only to the tenths. We didn't start hundreds yet. To be able to make a model of it, and then to be able to, like, if they saw the number, to be able to read to me how they would say that.
Great. I noticed that it fit very well. When I came in, I noticed that you had your learning target posted. And so on the Iowa Teaching Standards and Criteria, that fit very well with 6B, which is establishes, communicates, and models and maintains the responsible student behavior. So I thought that the kids had a clear purpose of what you were about to teach them, and clearly they were learning what you intended for them to learn. So were your instructional goals met throughout this lesson?
I think so, especially it being the first time they've seen decimals. I would say the majority, about 20 of the students, really got tenths. There were about 4 or 5 students who I think really, when I go on, will need more work with the tenths. They'll need a little bit more.
Tell me what you will do differently as you move forward with those few students that didn't grasp the concept. What will you do for those students differently?
When we start the problem of the day, I will go through the problem like I always do, and I will launch it with the entire group, and then they will go back with their number lines. Each student had their own number line that they had to fill in. For those students who are struggling, I will keep them for a second launch and get them started so they are very clear on what it is they're supposed to be doing, and I can double check to make sure that they're okay before I send them off on their own. I think that second launch really helps them.
Fantastic. Did you alter your goals or your instructional strategies as your lesson progressed?
I spent more time on the number work portion than I thought I originally would. I thought that they would catch on more quickly than they did. So with the number work, I really had to slow down and go into more depth than I thought I would. So that part took longer than I thought.
Sure. I noticed that when you had students that were struggling, that you were going back and pulling them individually.
Yes.
And really focusing in on the needs that they weren't mastering.
Yeah.
That fits very well with the Iowa Teaching Standard 5E, which is providing timely and constructive feedback to those students.
Yes.
So well done with that. Also, with 5A in the Iowa Teaching Standards, the alignment of your classroom assessment. Tell me what you'll do to assess the students.
Well, each day when we leave, I'm going to use those number lines as well, especially this first week, as their exit slip, so I can see if they're getting it or if I need to keep going over it with them the next day. But then as we finish the unit, or as we finish that first standard of tenths, I will use the district assessments that we have as a 4th grade district-wide.
Good. How were you able throughout the lesson to check to see that the students understood that the understood the material that was being presented?
As I walked around and conferenced with the students, I was looking at their number lines, and I would pick a few of the numbers that they were writing, ask them to say the number to me, or ask them maybe could you draw a model of that number for me? And there were quite, like I said, those 4 or 5 that were struggling, I finally had to take them and pull them back at the table for a small group to kind of go over it again and refer them back to the number line we did as a whole class up on the board.
Is that pretty typical for you to have to do? Does it seem to be the same students that you need to
Yes.
do some reteaching with?
Yes, and it always, especially with fractions, it was very correlated to fractions. The students who struggled with fractions at first are struggling so far with decimals also.
Have you had any students that maybe did some type of pre-assessment that didn't need the classroom instruction or the whole group instruction that have had any enrichment or not with this core content?
Not with decimals yet. Because fourth grade is the first year that they get decimals, I didn't allow for students to be able to exit out yet for the compacting. I want all of them there for that explicit instruction, especially right away at first.
Sure. How will you assess your class formatively? You talked about the district assessments. Can you tell me some more about that?
Well, we have developed that all fourth grade teachers of the whole district use for decimals, and I believe it's tenths and hundredths, so I'll have to, for just the tenths part, I like to break it up into tenths and then add the hundredths in. So I'll use some of my own, like the number lines and things like that until we get through the hundredths, and we'll keep adding. I'll use my own little exit slips or problems that we use in class until we get to the district assessment. That'll be probably a week or so down the road before we get to that.
What will you do with that district assessment information? Do you provide your students and other fourth graders with MTSS instruction?
Yes. As our PLC, we have, I think, until next Friday. Next Friday, our PLC will meet and have that assessment data, and then we'll RTI those students who are still struggling with the decimal concepts.
Great. What do you think went well? What was the best part of this lesson?
It's always cool to see when you start with fractions. They know fractions. They can put up any, and I did tenths purposely because I wanted to connect it to decimals. And then after you do 1 or 2 tenths decimal wise, they catch on very quickly. It's really cool to see how they make that connection between the fraction and the decimal, because they don't see that as the same number or the same quantity. So once they start to get that connection, that's always good to see.
Great. If you had the opportunity to teach this lesson again to the same group of students, what would you do differently to improve the lesson, and why?
I would definitely, like I think I had kind of said before, I would, once I give them the problem to go back and work independently at their desks on their own individual number lines, I would, for those students that I noticed that were struggling, I would have them stay at the carpet. When we introduce the problem to the kids, we call that our launch, and then we let them go work. I would give a second launch for those kids that I kind of knew would struggle, and then get them started, like start the first number choice with them, so that way they're started and they have some confidence before they go work on their own, and they really are sure about what they're doing.
Sure. Speaking of confidence, I saw one of your students kind of shut down midway. She became frustrated.
Yes.
What was your strategy when working with her?
She thrives very much on one-to-one. So I just pulled her back to the table, and then referring her back to what we had on the whiteboard to help her make connections. Okay. She just really needs the one-on-one. She kind of gets lost in the whole class.
Sure. Mm-hmm. How will your lesson change for the next day based on checking for understanding? So what would it look like today from what you did yesterday?
Now tomorrow, or when we start from here, I won't have the fractions up there. I will start right away with tenths because I want to start moving into hundredths. So we'll start talking about tenths, and I'll have kids, some kids put the number up. I'll have some kids read the number. I'll have some kids make the model. And then from there, start to talk about hundreds and
Okay.
how there's 10 of those in each tenth. And we'll start to work our way into hundreds with models, reading the numbers, and writing them.
That seems to go very well into my next question about talking about the future and what your action plan is. And I think that you just answered that very well. But if you had that crystal ball, what would you hope to see the kids? Where would you hope to see the kids at proficient level? What does proficient level look like to you? What goals and action plan would you set?
Well, going back and forth between tenths and hundreds, I really want them to be able to, like I said, read a decimal, whether it's tenths or hundreds. I want them to be able to make a model of it, and I want them to be able to write it if I were to say the decimal to them. So the struggle always is going back and forth between tenths and hundreds. So if you had like 0.3 and then 0.03, they always get the tenths and the hundreds mixed up. So I want that to be
Super. Well, thank you so much. And I think it was a great lesson, and I appreciate you taking your time.
Thank you.
Thanks.